Hi, thank you for joining us for the sixth episode of Nima Voices, a virtual interview series. My name is Emily Anderson, and I am a curator at the Japanese American National Museum. And today we're joined by Christine Piper. Now, before I turn to Christine, I wanted to briefly introduce the Discover Nikkei project and the Nima Voices series for those who are unfamiliar. So Discover Nikkei is the Japanese American National Museum's international community-based web project with major funding from the Nippon Foundation, launched in 2005. The site is in 4 languages: English, Japanese, Spanish, and Portuguese, and shares unique Nikkei stories around the world, from the US, Brazil, Peru, Canada, Argentina, Mexico, and other countries around the world. New stories are published daily on the website. Nima are members of the Discover Nikkei online community. Hailing from all over the world, they each bring unique experiences and perspectives to the site's rich archive of stories. Nima Voices is an interview series where we uplift our Nima through brief but enlightening interviews. So today I'll be talking to award-winning mixed-race Japanese-Australian author, Christine Piper. So first, a little bit about Christine before I start with my questions. Christine's debut novel, After Darkness, published in 2014, is a story about a Japanese doctor interned as an enemy alien in Australia during World War II. It won the Australian Vogels Literary Award and was shortlisted for the prestigious Miles Franklin Literary Award, and is currently studied by Year 12 English students in the state of Victoria. She also won the 2014 Guy Morrison Award for Literary Journalism and the 2014 Colibra Essay Prize for her creative nonfiction essay, Unearthing the Past, about civilian activists in Japan and the nation's conflicted wartime memory. And you can find her website at christinepiper.com. And I think Joy will pop that into, we'll share that with those of you who are watching. So, also, in 2018, she served as a field research facilitator for the Global Nikkei Young Adult Research Project, for which she conducted focus groups with young adult Nikkei in Australia. She also served as a facilitator for Discover Nikkei's What Does It Mean to be Nikkei in 2021 program earlier this year. And that is available to view on YouTube. After my conversation with Christine, I will ask her some of your questions. So please use the chat feature in YouTube or Facebook to ask questions, and I'll get to a few of them at the end of the conversation. So whenever you think of a question, just go ahead and pop it into the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. You'll need to be logged into YouTube or Facebook to use the chat feature. We'll be sharing links to the articles we mentioned in the chat and also in the video description afterwards. Okay, so Christine, let's get started. So first of all, can you tell me a little bit about your really unique background?
Yeah, well, I was born in South Korea, in Seoul, but my mum is Japanese and my dad is Australian. To tell you the context a bit, my dad studied Japanese and economics at university in Australia. And then I think towards the end of his degree, he went on exchange to Japan for a few months. And in that time, my mother's family hosted him in Tokyo for a little while. And so, yeah, they met each other then. They were both 19 at the time. They didn't actually get together as a couple until like 8 or 9 years later, but they sort of remained in touch in that time. And then my older sister was born in Tokyo because my dad was working there for a trading company. And then the family was transferred to Korea, South Korea, Seoul. I think my dad helped open we were in Seoul. And then at age 1, I moved to Australia with my family. We were in Canberra for a little bit, but then most of the time we've been in Sydney, which is my hometown. And aside from that, there was about 8 months when I was 6 or 7, and my dad got a job as an assistant trade commissioner for Australia in Tokyo. And so the family moved over there for 8 months so he could work in that role. But at the same time, my mum had recently started a business where she was running a a residential language college for young Japanese people who were coming to Australia on a working holiday visa. And so they would stay for 4 weeks in this college that my mum ran and learn basics about, how to live in Australia, basic English, how to use a post office and the train, that sort of thing. But yeah, aside from the 8 months we spent in Japan, I mostly lived in Australia up until school finished.
So, it sounds like you did a lot of sort of there's a period where you did a lot of back and forth. How did being exposed to these different communities help shape your identity?
Yeah, well, I have to say when I did year 12 in Australia, and after that, I wanted to go on exchange to Japan. So I went there for 6 months on exchange, and I wrote an article about this on the Nikkei Australia website. But yeah, that was a really sort of seminal experience because it was the first time I'd lived in Japan as an adult by myself. And I think up until that point in high school, as a mixed race Japanese Australian, I sort of felt like there was a piece of me that was missing, and I thought that going to Japan would help me find that missing piece of my identity. So that's what I was expecting. But then, of course, when I got to Japan, I realized that I was even more of an outsider in Japan than I was in Australia. And it was sort of a slow realization over time that, my identity wasn't really something that was going to be found ever. And I just sort of, over a period of 6 to 12 months, I realized that, your identity can be what you make of it yourself. You can create your own identity, and it doesn't have to be how other people see you. And, you can shape it yourself and sort of, I guess, take more power back that way. So, that experience had a big impact on me. And then a few years later, after that experience, I took a gap year from university and I went back to Japan and I taught English there for 6 months. And that was probably the most fun I've had in Japan, just living by myself. I was 20 and, meeting people from around the world, all these other fellow English teachers. And then I went back to Japan again when I was 31. I did a creative doctorate at the University of Technology in Sydney, and I went on this residential language college for researchers in Osaka, and I was there for 6 months doing research and learning Japanese for my research. I have been back quite a few times. I think I've lived there 4 times in my life for 6 to 8 months each time. So I keep going back, but I'm not sure when I'll go back now. I think I've come to the conclusion that I love visiting Japan, but I think I prefer, living in Australia.
Mm-hmm. So then let me ask you about the situation in Australia, because, you don't really hear about Nikkei Australians.
Mm-hmm.
What is the Japanese Australian community, if we could even call it a community, like there? And what is it like to be a mixed race Japanese Australian?
Yeah. Well, firstly, we don't actually use the term Nikkei really. I don't know why. It's sort of seen as more of a North American term. We would say Japanese Australian or hafu, half Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
I always talk about myself as half Japanese or part Japanese. And there isn't, growing up, there wasn't a really big Japanese community. We have a lot of Asians in Australia and in Sydney, a lot of Chinese, Vietnamese, Indonesians, Malaysians, but not that many Japanese. So it was small. And I didn't go to Japanese language school, which is a common way that sort of, I guess, people of in the Japanese diaspora sort of find their community in Sydney. I'm not sure why my parents didn't feel the need to send me to Japanese school, but they didn't. And so we knew other Japanese families, a few of them, and we knew some mixed race families, but we would sort of see them occasionally. But, I felt like I didn't really feel like we were a part of the community growing up, the Japanese community. It was more sort of after I lived in Japan and then I came back and I was at university and I joined the Japanese Society and I met other Japanese students, and sort of more as an adult, I've sort of found the Japanese community, and it is growing as time goes by. There are more Japanese who have settled in Australia, and of course with my work through Nikkei Australia.com, we're a collective of artists, researchers, and media practitioners who are interested in the Japanese diaspora in Australia and interested in sharing that information with the community, both in Australia and worldwide. And so through that, I've met a lot of other Japanese people. I feel like I'm more sort of part of the community that way.
Mm-hmm. So, given that there isn't a really large community of Japanese Australians, and also that you didn't feel like that was your immediate sort of community growing up, it's really interesting that you picked as the topic for your debut novel, a Japanese doctor who's interned during World War II. What can you, I guess briefly, because I also really want to ask you about the novel, but what can you tell us about the history of Japanese in Australia? Not just like your own personal experience is obviously more recent, but this novel tells us or suggests that there were Japanese in Australia, say 75 years and more ago. So what, have we lost Christine? I think we're having a slight technical difficulty, but she'll come back. Australia is a very, very large country with not very high population density. So I learned this by visiting, that internet coverage is quite different. So while we're waiting for Christine to come back, I would highly recommend, for those of you who are interested in her novel. Her novel is a fictionalized account of a Japanese doctor who finds himself interned during the war in a camp in South Australia. I highly recommend visiting her website, which is christinepiper.com, and there's more information about the novel there. And I actually spent a year in New Zealand, and that was my first exposure to sort of the Southern Hemisphere. And it was very mind-opening to sort of see the world from a different perspective. So I'm sure we have people who have joined us tonight from Australia for sure, and hopefully also from New Zealand. But for those of us who are sort of, Northern Hemisphere dominant, I think, at least for me, that was my experience, was that it was a really eye-opening time. But I hadn't realized the extent of sort of Asian immigration, or sort of how far back Asian immigration goes in Australia. There are people who they think they're Chinese settlers or Chinese merchants in Northern Australia long before Europeans arrived. So I'm really looking forward. Oh, there you are. You're back. Okay, now I can stop rattling off my very limited knowledge of Australia to people who probably already know. So if you want to use your novel to sort of serve as a sort of a guide to talk about this, what can you tell us about the history of Japanese in Australia, and also how did you choose this really interesting topic as the topic of your first novel?
Yeah, well, I studied creative writing in undergraduate degree, and then I did honors, and then I did a creative doctorate. And my undergraduate, I was like writing stories about Chinese Australians, and then for honors I wrote a story about a Vietnamese Australian, and then I just realized I was circling around all these stories about immigration, and then I decided to approach, I suppose, a more personal topic for my doctoral thesis, which is the Japanese migrant experience. And initially I was going to have a sort of more expansive topic where I was looking at pearl divers who worked in the sort of northwest of Australia, and they were interned during the war. But then my supervisor said that, for a PhD, it has to be original research. And she said there have been books written about the pearl divers in Broome before, which is a city in the northwest of Australia. But no one's written about internment, the Japanese civilians who were interned to Australia, in a novel before. So she said, why don't you focus on that? So I focused on the internment experience. So I didn't have any personal, there were no members of my family who were interned, but just because of my Japanese background, I was interested in this experience. And it was a really interesting topic because we have quite a unique internment experience in Australia. 4,300 Japanese civilians were interned in Australia, but we also interned roughly 4,000 each of Italians and Germans. So we're sort of more egalitarian in our discrimination. But of those 4,300 Japanese civilians who were interned, 3/4 of them had actually been arrested in overseas Allied controlled countries, such as the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia. And I think there's an image that I can show just a map of where these countries are in relation to Australia. And so, a lot of people from other parts of the world don't realize how close Australia is to other parts of Asia. So these Japanese were working in the Dutch East Indies in Indonesia, present day in Indonesia, French New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, which is present-day Vanuatu, and also, so those countries. And they were arrested and interned in Australia because the Australian government entered an agreement with the governments of those countries to incarcerate those Japanese civilians if those other countries paid for it. So it was a unique situation, and it just meant that the camps were truly a melting pot of cultures. There were people who people didn't speak the same language. So the people who only spoke Japanese, there are quite a lot of those. There were some people who only spoke English, some people who only spoke French, because a lot of the New Caledonian Japanese had been living there for many decades. And so they're all sort of, rounded up and interned together in Australia under the banner of enemy alien, but they're actually very diverse. And in Australia, the roughly 1,100 Japanese civilians who were interned and who had been living in Australia and then arrested and interned in Australia, they represented 98% of all the Japanese who were registered at the outbreak of war in Australia. So pretty much everyone, all the Japanese were interned. But in comparison to the Italian and German populations, about 31 or 32% of those populations in Australia were interned. So it was a very...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just curious with the Japanese who were living in Australia. Were they primarily in coastal cities, or were they in more, interior, sort of rural agricultural areas, or what types of things drew people to Australia, as far as you know?
Yeah. So if you look at that map again, those who were interned, I think it was over 50%, maybe up to 70%. Were involved in the sort of work from the northwest. If you go back to the one of Australia, sort of Broome, Darwin, and Thursday Island, those three cities were all where pearl shell diving took place. And so there were Japanese involved in the pearl shell diving trade living in those areas. And they made up over half of the Japanese Australians who were living in Australia who were arrested and interned in Australia. And there were others from the bigger cities such as Sydney and Melbourne. They were people who had probably migrated in the 20s or 30s. There was a boom in Australian wool, and Japan became a big trading partner with Australia. We bought a lot of Australian wool, and also Australia started buying more of Japanese textiles. So they would have been the internees who worked for, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, those type of big companies. And then they're also sort of more Japanese who'd been in Australia for a longer time and who were probably worked in laundries or farmers. And a lot of those Japanese had probably started out in the pearl shell diving industry and then sort of somehow, worked their way into different trades. There was sort of, I guess, three types of internees of the ones that were living in Australia when war broke out.
So it really is a real diverse group of people. not a
Yeah.
huge group, but a very incredibly diverse group of people.
Yeah.
So how did you sort of come to select a doctor, this doctor figure, as the central sort of way to tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, I started off sort of writing this thing set in Broome, sort of third person tale, and then I just don't think it was very good. My supervisor said, she was sort of like, yeah, just leave this, and then I was, procrastinating for weeks, trying to, brainstorm how I could reapproach this novel. And then one day, just this voice popped into my head, and it was, I just knew instinctively it was the voice of, an old Japanese man looking back on his life. And then I kind of, worked out that he was a doctor, and then I always had this feeling as I was writing the first draft that he had had a deeper trauma that happened in his past. And then it wasn't until I sort of got through maybe 2/3 of the first draft that I actually realized what the trauma was. And it was something that happened in Japan in the 30s, some work he was involved in the 30s. And that contributed his mental conflict that sort of plagues him throughout his life.
So just for time, I'm going to ask you one more question about the book, and then I'm going to ask you very quickly about sort of your involvement with the Nikkei stuff now before we open it up for questions from the audience. So in the research that you were doing for your book, what surprised you the most? What was the thing that sort of surprised you the most in your research?
I think it was the very heterogeneous nature of the internment experience in Australia. The fact that there were all these different cultures sort of mashed together. When you write a novel, you need conflict. And I think, before I knew much about the topic going into it, I thought, oh yeah, the conflict will come from the Australian guards mistreating the internees. That seemed like the obvious source of conflict. But as I was researching the novel, I couldn't really find any evidence of the guards mistreating the internees. And not to say that it didn't happen. I'm sure there were isolated incidents, but they weren't mistreated in general. But then as I did a lot of research in the archives, and I was researching the archives, I just found that I was gravitated towards the reports about mixed race Japanese internees, sort of the Japanese Australian mixed race internees, or the sort of internees who had been living in Australia a very long time and were very Australianized. And they seem to clash a lot with the sort of the dominant culture at camp, which were these internees. A lot of them were from the Dutch East Indies, because they tended to be Japanese who were sort of recent migrants to the Dutch East Indies, and they seemed more educated, and they were very nationalistic, and very obviously pro-Japanese and wanted Japan to win the war. And so they were interned with these people, and they had completely opposing points of view, and it was very difficult for the Australian internees and the mixed race internees, because they felt like they were rejected by their country, because they were interned for being on suspicion, being a security risk, but really most of them were quite loyal to Australia. So that's where I found my conflict in the novel, from the clash between the sort of the dominant ideology at camp and these Australian born internees, or the mixed race internees.
It's so interesting, especially sort of the source of conflict and the fact that people are coming from these very different sort of and colonial contexts, right? And all sort of stuck together and trying to figure out how to navigate what, a very difficult experience. So I have so many other questions, but I'm supposed to also ask you about your work with the current Japanese Australian community. So you participated in the Japan, or the Nippon Foundation's Global Nikkei Young Adult Research Project as a field research assistant, what was your role and what did you learn about the community through this experience?
Yeah, so it was a great experience. I was just a field research officer. So my main role was conducting a focus group with some young Japanese, Australian Nikkei, so Japanese descendants in Australia, and just talking to them about their experience of growing up Japanese Australian and, you know, their values, that sort of thing. And yeah, it was quite heartening to learn that it was mostly a positive experience, but you know, there still isn't a lot of there isn't that much of a community in Australia. It's growing. But everyone involved expressed a desire to have more of a community, but we're just not there yet. And I think because although in Australia we do have a long history of migration, you know, the first Japanese migrant arrived in 1873. And certainly there are descendants of Japanese in Australia, like in the Nikkei Australia group I'm a part of, Andrew Hasegawa, he's a 4th generation Australian.
Wow.
But those people are very few and far between. So, I mean, until I got involved in Nikkei Australia, I'd never met anyone more than 2nd generation migrant to Australia. So yeah, there is a keenness to develop more of a Japanese community, but you know, we don't have the infrastructure yet because people are sort of more recent immigrants, and certainly my family reflects that experience. You know, my mum came to Australia, I think migrated in Australia in 1980, and yeah, so I'm just 2nd generation. Was there anything that was particularly surprising through that you learned through that, or was it sort of what you expected? It confirmed, I guess, I confirmed that my experience was actually typical of Australia, which I hadn't realized until then, because I thought, you know, not really knowing that many other Japanese Australians, I kind of thought I was, you know, like you sort of feel like you're quite isolated and you're the only one who feels this way. But actually, it was a very typical experience. And it also surprised me that the Japanese community in Australia has similarities with the communities in European countries. I thought that was interesting. So I guess as opposed to the Americas, where there's you know, a much longer tradition of immigration, and the numbers are so much bigger in Australia and Europe. It's the numbers are much smaller, and there aren't as many people. And also language is quite important to Australian Nikkei, like knowing the Japanese language. And through my work for the global Nikkei Young Adult Research Project, I realized that in Americas, you know, there are a lot of people who are very proudly Japanese, you know, yet they haven't, you know, their family hasn't spoken Japanese for generations, but it actually doesn't really make any difference to them. They're very proud of their Japanese identity. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to ask you a series of what we call rapid fire questions. So I'll just ask you a quick question and then you'll respond with the first thing that comes to mind. And while we're doing that, I welcome people in the audience, and somebody said hello from New Zealand, kia ora. I miss New Zealand so much, especially right now, and Australia as well. So, and you guys are, you know, slowly heading into spring now, right? So, anyway, sorry, I just, it was a really lovely year down there. So, yes, hello to everybody from Australia, New Zealand who's joining us. But while I'm asking Christine these rapid fire questions, please pop questions in the chat, because I'm sure, I mean, there's just so many, you know, interesting things about Christine's experience and her research and her book. So I would love you to have the opportunity to ask her. So don't be shy, pop those in. Okay, so here we go. Who is your Nikkei hero?
It's the British author Kazuo Ishiguro. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And yeah, he's written some amazing books. I love Never Let Me Go, and also, the name is escaping me, but the one about the English butler.
Remains of the Day.
Remains of the Day, yes, I studied it as part of my PhD. And yeah. Forgot the name.
I never read it. I've only seen the movie, but the last scene is so iconically English.
Oh yes.
And heartbreaking at the same time.
Yes.
Okay. He's that's so interesting because people see his name and assume he's Japanese, but he's British, right? Okay, so next question. This one is going to be hard. I promise. What is your favorite Japanese food?
Oh, this is
One
easy.
thing.
Sushi.
Oh,
Uni sushi. Very easy.
oh.
Yeah.
My mom loves a good uni sushi too.
Yes.
Should guys can go get uni sushi together. Okay. Um, what is the Japanese value that has most influenced you?
Yeah, probably gambaru, try your hardest. Yeah.
Okay. And then what do you like most about Discover Nikkei?
I like that it's a global platform and I can learn about the Japanese community in Brazil or in the Philippines or, or even Scandinavia. So yeah, it's a truly global platform.
Yeah, okay. So that's a wrap. Those are rapid fire questions. We're still waiting on questions from the audience. Come on, guys. Don't be shy. But then I will ask you another question. So you are now working on your second novel. So is your second novel also linked to Japanese Australia?
It is. It's set in the 1930s, but it's not about the war. It's about two Australians who journey to the Chicago World's Fair by cruise ship, and there are two main characters, and one of them is a 18-year-old Japanese Australian girl / woman, mixed race, and it's about her. She stows away on this cruise ship, and it's about her quest to make it in Hollywood as an actress. And on the way, she meets a young Australian amateur naturalist who is trying to steal a pair of Australian lungfish that are on the ship. And then they sort of team up, and she agrees to help him if he helps hide her on the ship. So it's about their journey to America. And I came up with the idea for her character sort of when I was doing archival research for my first novel, and there was just reading this security service dossiers. They would have transcripts of interviews with Japanese Australians and who were potentially a security risk. And there was one young woman who really caught my attention just because she had a really fiery personality, and I think it would have been so easy for her to just play the game and say like, oh yes, like I'm loyal to Australia, and but I think the police had sort of offended her, and she just really sarcastically replied, like, oh yes, my allegiance with Japan, and she was just really like hot-tempered like that, and she was interned for it, even though she shouldn't have been, because she was Australian born. So her character really stuck in my mind, and I really felt for her. So when I was coming up with an idea for my second novel, she came to mind.
I'm so looking forward to your next book. That actual person sounds really fascinating, and sounds like a really fascinating person to build a character off of. And now we have some questions. Okay, so let's start with question from Tim. Says, love your novel, Christine. How do you think the repatriation of Japanese after World War II affects Japanese and Australian relationships, or how affects Japanese-Australian relationships to internment?
Yeah, so after the war, the Japanese who'd been interned, whether they were living in Australia or New Caledonia or Dutch East Indies, they were forcibly repatriated to Japan, unless they were married to an Australian or British-born person, or unless they themselves had been born in Australia. So the rest of them were just all packed off to Japan, whether they liked it or not. And after that, there were only 300 Japanese nationals left registered in Australia. So it really affected the community. It shrunk to such a small degree. And all those people who went back to Japan, they sort of, they had to cut their ties with Australia. And also, this is going off topic a bit, but the French and New Caledonians, a lot of them had families in New Caledonia, but they were sent to Japan against their will. And a lot of them never saw those families again, and never even had any contact with again. Because I met some women who that had happened to their grandfather, and I think because he was illiterate, they weren't even able to exchange letters. So that was the last time they saw.
Wow.
But back to the Australian situation. There are only 300 left in Australia after the war. So it was really difficult because obviously, after the war, there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. I know that the people who remained in Australia after the war, they experienced a lot of discrimination. Some people were shot at, some people rocks thrown at them. It was difficult for them to get jobs. And also one of the big things was that the people who were interned didn't receive any reparations for it. So, sometimes they lost all their businesses and they weren't able to, had to start from scratch again. So that made it really difficult. And in Australia now, there's still, the average Australian doesn't know anything about this topic because there were so few left of them after the war. And it's only now that people like me and the others in the Nikkei Australia group are working to try and communicate, this history.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from Michelle who says, what do you hope to pass on to your children from Japanese culture?
I don't want to force the culture onto them. And not that my parents ever did that to me at all, but I'd like for it to be available to them. And, if they have an interest, they can take it up. So, I try to speak some Japanese to them, and I've used mainly Japanese babysitters in the past to sort of pass that language onto them. I would like to spend, a few months living in Japan again with the children, just to give them that experience, because the time I lived in Japan when I was 6, 7, it was, I think it's a very formative time when you're young and had so many rich cultural experiences. I just remember a lot of, summer festivals and, it was a very surreal time in my life. And so it really stands out in my, in my memory now. So I'd like to give that opportunity to them. And if they want to develop a further interest in Japan, great. But if not, I'm not going to force it onto them.
And this question is in a sense related, even though it's more about your own personal experience. From Sophie, hi Christine, were there any Japanese or Asian characters or figures you related to while growing up in the 80s and 90s? Or was this something that came later?
I mean, it was probably just the pop culture. I wouldn't say I related to them, but, I just became interested in Japanese pop culture. TV shows, Monkey Magic, and later on it was sort of anime. That was sort of more in the later 90s that I grew up more into anime. But yeah, I guess I didn't really relate to them. I just thought it was cool.
So we're a little bit past time, although we went a little over since we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Christine. I mean, this is just sort of like the first bite at the apple of learning about, I think in general, I know this from my own personal experience, but I feel like certainly from, a lot of Americans are American-centric, right? We all know this about us, and that it's very hard for us to see the world from other perspectives. And I thought I was worldly because I grew up in Japan and, I've traveled all over Europe, but going to the Southern Hemisphere was a very different experience for me. So I think it's great to expand. And like you said, Discover Nikkei allows us to make these connections, not just in sort of part regions of the world, but truly globally. So it's been so interesting, and I'm really looking forward to your second book and your future research, and everybody can stay abreast of Christine's progress with these things on her website. And before I turn this or shut us down completely, I just want to remind people, for those of you who primarily for those of you who are in the LA area or can come, we have opened 2 exhibits recently. Stanley Hayami's A Life in Pieces and Mineo Kubo's masterpiece. They're both on view, and they will be up and available to see through early next year. So please see them. They're both really beautifully done. And there is also content related to Stanley Hayami currently, and there will soon be related to Mineo Kubo on our YouTube channel. And we continue to do, the museum is now back open for visitors, but we are continuing to do virtual content like this and other, and JANM content that is viewable on our YouTube channel. So please join us for other live programs and recorded programs. You know, one thing we've learned, that sort of an unexpected benefit of the world shutting down was we all had to go virtual, and we discovered that way people who couldn't join us before could join us, and it's really enriched our experiences. So we're continuing to do that because we want to make sure we continue those relationships. There will be another Nima Voices Wednesday, December 8th at 7 p.m., guest hosted by Masako Miki, who will be talking with Yusuke Kawai, who is a Japanese journalist and writer who has been sharing articles on Discover Nikkei since 2010, and it will be our first Japanese language episode. So for other things, be sure to check out, check out the Discover Nikkei website. We're currently accepting submissions for Nikkei Generations Connecting Families and Communities, special series through September 30th. We want stories that take a look at intergenerational relationships in Nikkei communities around the world, with a particular focus on the emerging younger generations of Nikkei and how they connect or don't with their roots and with older generations. So go to 5dn.org/generations for more information about submitting your story. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and please join us again for future Discover Nikkei programs. And Christine, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me to talk about the Australian community.